Thank you. So it's Pekudei Bays. And before we go into our Sikha, let us celebrate together the bar mitzvah of our classmate Rachel Kaplan's grandson, Mordechai Rivkin, and the wedding of our classmate Joni Tansky's granddaughter, Yutka Rachel Poulter, who's getting married to Shalom Friedman in exactly a week. We want to celebrate today while Joni's still with us, and then we will mention it again next week, Be'ezus Hashem. We want to mention the fourth birthday of Yosef Kravitsky, who is an honorable member of our class. Could he come to the camera so we can wish him happy birthday?
I think he's shy, but maybe he'll.
Okay, happy birthday, Yosef Yitzchak. Shnas Hatzlacha.
He said thank you.
Okay, and lots of birthdays in Chana Perlman's family this week. Everybody should have a Shnas Hatzlacha Ubracha and Arichas Yamim V'Shanim Tevis, long, happy, healthy, wonderful years. Our Sikha today is quite beautiful as usual. But it always strikes me when there are themes that, everybody can see kind of like the beauty and the awesomeness. And then there are things that we just like kind of gloss over. And the Rebbe says, wait a minute, wait, not so fast. There's something very, very important and beautiful going on here. And this is kind of an example thereof. And for most of the Sikha, the Rebbe just helps us understand something that's would otherwise, I think, be like a kind of a flyover zone. And then in the last part gives us, a hera, gives us a yena shel Torah, gives us a way of bringing this home in really a breathtaking way. Aleph. And if you have a chumash, it'll be easier for you to kind of see what the Rebbe is referring to. Kasav HaKli Yakar writes, "Betama shematzinu bekasav l'gabe meleches ubinyan hamishkan." Moshe Rabbeinu asa cheshbon al masha asa min hakesev hanacheshet edidvas hamishkan, v'lo asa cheshbon al masha asa min hazav. The Kli Yakar explains the reason why when we look at the psukim, when it comes to the work, the building of the Mishkan, that Moshe Rabbeinu reported to Bnei Yisrael what he did with the silver, what he did with the copper, that was donated to the Mishkan, but he did not report on what was done with the gold, which, is the most important of all, the most expensive of all materials that were donated. So there's just a lot to speak about here, but it's not in the Sikha, but just the notion that Moshe Rabbeinu was accused of possibly pocketing some of the money, and Jewish leadership and how difficult it is, and how Moshe Rabbeinu rushed to be transparent and nevertheless still suffered accusations, but did not choose to reprimand Bnei Yisrael for this, but very humbly gave them an accounting of what he did with the materials that they all donated. But the Kli Yakar says, what's going on here? Why about the copper and the silver and not about the gold? And in a footnote in the Sikha, the Rebbe explains that there were also, of course, other materials, but these were, the most significant. These were the most expensive, and these were the ones about which there might be the most kind of speculation. Okay. So we're continuing, dahainu, meaning, lefisha tekev kasher kvar gamru kom lechsa mishkan bechlal befrat, v'chol ma shehaya lehem lasos min hakesev hanacheshes, kvar asu hakol. Meaning that once they finished the work of the Mishkan, of constructing the Mishkan, generally and specifically, and everything that had to be made out of the silver and the copper, they did everything, and then Haya Moshe lahut litin cheshbon miyad, and Moshe Rabbeinu was like lahut means like on fire to give them this calculation immediately. Like he enthusiastically and with alacrity, b'terem asiyas bigdei kahuna shebehem hayazahav, and he did this even before the bigdei kahuna were fashioned, And the Bigdei Kahuna also had elements of gold in them, and yet Moshe Rabbeinu gave them the cheshbon, he gave them the exact report and the calculation and the inventory, kedei lahaitzias atzmei min achshad. And this is what the Kli Yakar says. In order to exonerate himself of the suspicion and the speculation that he might have done some wrongdoing with the materials. And he didn't want to wait until after the Bigdei Kahuna, the clothing for the Kohanim were fashioned, and then give the overall calculation of what was done with the silver and the gold and the copper. Rather, he rushed to give it even before the Bigdei Kahuna were fashioned. And why didn't he then report to them and give them an accounting of the gold immediately after he finished fashioning the clothing for the Kohanim? Bir HaKli Yakar al pi divrei hamedrash. The Kli Yakar explains, he addresses this question based on a famous medrash, and that is Kishaba Moshe laseis cheshbon al kol davar v'davar. When Moshe came to actually give them an exact report, a line-by-line report on all the materials that they had donated. Chasar min hamishkol elev v'shva me'ois v'chamisha v'shivim shkolim. 1,775 shkolim, the weight, the worth of that was missing. V'shachach v'lo haya yodea ma asa mehem. He simply forgot, and he could not report what was made with that gold. Yatsa Baskal v'amra, a voice from heaven came and said, that the Baskal explained that this was made into the hooks that would hold the curtains to the amudim, to the posts, and this created the perimeter around the azara, the courtyard of the Mishkan. And referencing the Medrash reference the Kayem Ashanemar, and the Baskal came out in order to validate what it says in Parshas Ba'aleischa about Moshe, when this is Hashem speaking to Miriam and Aharon. You might remember that they were having a discussion about Moshe and his inability to be with his wife and so on and so forth. And Hashem said, Loichein, it's not like you think. Avdi Moshe b'chol beisi ne'emanhu. My servant Moshe is loyal. Everything he does is correct. Koloimar. But this means to say that afal pisha edus habaskal v'sa elef goymar ha'isa b'negel l'kesef v'loy l'zahav, even though the Baskal, I'm sorry, I made a mistake before. I said it was gold. It was silver shkolim. And even though the Baskal, the voice from heaven came to validate and ratify what happened with that missing 1,775 shkolim worth of silver, Mikol Makom, still in all, me'achas b'nei Yisrael rosh min hashemayim me'idim al Moshe shuv loy hutzuchu l'cheshbon al hazahav. Once heaven validated Moshe and said Moshe would never pocket any funds or pocket any materials, he simply forgot what was made with them. It was fashioned into the hooks. So once that happened, he didn't have to give a cheshbon on the gold, because Bnei Yisrael trusted him after that. It's true that the Baskal was about the silver, but in their minds, it was all good. Amnam, however, bir zeh eino mechaver. But this doesn't completely compute. It's not completely satisfactory. Why? Ki aleph. Number one, dvarim elu shebe'edus habaskal ha'iskim b'cheshbon ha'kesef v'sa'elav v'shva me'ez v'goymer nemru b'tchilas ha'pasuk lefnei cheshbon hanecheshes. Okay, so if you want, you could look into the Torah and take a look at Perek Lamed Ches 38, and we're looking at 22. I'm sorry, no, that's something that we want to reference later. Sorry, give me a moment. If somebody finds it, just tell us. I'm so sorry. I had it written down and I wrote it on a different paper that I didn't bring up to my office. Okay, I don't want to take time, but what you look in, you'll see it. And if I was less nervous, I would find it. That first the pasuk tells us what happened with this 1,775 shekel worth of silver that they were fashioned into these hooks. And then it tells us how much copper there was. It gives us the cheshbon of the necheshes, the imkain. So if the baskel came out, which is reflected in a pasuk in this parsha, if it would come out after that, we would understand that we don't need a cheshbon for the gold because we already have a cheshbon for the silver and the copper, and then heaven ratifies that Moshe is 100% honest, so we don't need a cheshbon for the gold. But that's not what happens. We have the cheshbon of the necheshes of the copper after that. V'im kain, and if so, geshem shalei hutzach Moshe litin cheshbon ben hazav la'achar divrei baskel kain lehaya alav limsars cheshbon hanecheshes. Seemingly, once the baskel came out and said what happened with that amount of shkolim worth of silver, why does the Torah have to give us the cheshbon for necheshes? In other words, if that's why we don't have a cheshbon for the gold, because of the baskel, so why is the baskel not enough to alleviate the concern about the copper? And beis ubechol oifen, and even if this was not the case, once we have a baskel coming from heaven saying that Moshe is loyal, Moshe is honest, why doesn't Hashem send this voice from heaven at a time where it would completely obviate the necessity for Moshe to give any kind of cheshbonos? If there's going to be a baskel and it's going to alleviate the suspicion, why don't you just do it preemptively, and then Moshe doesn't have to give any kind of accounting? But that's not what happens. It happens after the silver, before the copper, and that way it does not include kolel cheshbon and kesef and acheshes. So why not do it differently? And the Rebbe says, "Shari klape shmaya galia shasida b'nei Yisrael achshoid by," because of course everything is revealed before heaven, before Hashem. So Hashem knew that they were going to enter into these suspicions regarding Moshe. So why not prophylactically just take away the suspicion? Why does the baskel come only in middle? So that's the question that the Rebbe opens up with. And in the second Seif Beis, the Rebbe says that understanding why it all has to go through Moshe's hands. Why does everything have to be brought to Moshe? Then Moshe has to give an accounting. That there's something very profound happening. The Yishleimar, we might say, Pekudei hamishkan asher pukar al pi Moshe. That what this parsha opens up with, the inventory that Moshe delineates line by line, everything that was brought and how much there was of it and what it was used for and so on and so forth. This is not just about giving an accounting. This is not just about reporting. But rather, this process is necessary and essential to the whole project of building the Mishkan. Ubahaktim. And we will preface with the following, and then in Sif Gimel, the Rebbe will begin his explanation of why it's so necessary for this process to precede the erection of the Mishkan. L'chayr, the Rebbe says, seemingly, Madua Chazar Hakasu v'Amar Khan b'tchilas haparsha miyad la'achar pasuk harishon u'Betzalel ben Uri ben Chor lamata Yehuda asas kol shativa shemes Moshe v'Itay Ahaliyav ben Achisamach lamata Dan Charash v'Choshev Gomer. So these are psukim 22 and 23 in chapter 38. And the Rebbe says, seemingly, why does the Torah have to come and tell us this again? This is information we already have. And pay attention that in that first pasuk, Chav Beis, it says, they did, Betzalel ben Uri ben Chor, the Mata Yehuda did, es kol asher tziva Hashem es Moshe, everything that Hashem commanded to Moshe. And look at Rashi. It does not say here, Asher Tziva, that he had been commanded by Moshe, but rather all that the Eternal had commanded Moshe. Even things that his teacher had not said to him, he alone figured out what Moshe had been told by God at Mount Sinai. And then it goes on to say that with him was Ahaliav, the son of Achisamach from Dan, and he was a craftsman and a skilled weaver and an embroiderer and so on and so forth. Back in the Sikha, this is information that the Torah has already given us. Why is this being repeated here? But based on what the Midrashim teach, the al Perish Rashi, and based also on the Rashi that we just read, the pasuk comes to inform us Shebetzalel asas kol asher tziva shemes Moshe. Asher tziva isay Moshe ein ksivkan ela kol asher tziva shemes Moshe. Afilu dvarim shalei amar lei Moshe rabbi hiskima data lemashenemer leMoshe b'Sinai. Rashi and the Midrashim come to tell us that this teaches us that Betzalel was able to deduce even things that Moshe had not told him. He was able to know what Hashem had told Moshe on Har Sinai, and to align with those with those commandments and what Hashem wanted. Yosef Yitzchak, happy birthday. Ulam. But seemingly, we need additional explanation for why this information is repeated. And the Rebbe says, why do we need additional information? Because of the placement of where this information is in the parsha. Lama nemar hadavar bein hapasuk ele pekudei hamishkan goymer shepukad al pi Moshe lecheshbon kolazav goymer v'kesev pekudei ha'eda. Why is this information placed between the opening pasuk, which is these are the accountings, but before the accounting actually begins? Mikoyim shel dvarim eluhu, seemingly the correct place for where this information belongs, even if it's repetitive, would be le'il, higher, b'seif Parshas Vayakel. It either should have appeared at the end of Parshas Vayakel, or later, after the accounting is done. But here, it kind of is not only repetitive, but seemingly out of place, kind of interrupting. Because the Torah begins this parsha by saying, these are the accountings, then interrupts with who oversaw the project, and then goes back to the accounting. So in Seif Gimel, the Rebbe explains, Gimel, V'habir bazeh yesh laimar, and the explanation might be said, HaMishkan hayitzarech liyeshayach leklal Yisrael, that the reason these psukim are here, and then there's the enumeration, has to do with the profundity of the relationship of the Mishkan to each and every Jew. The Mishkan had to belong to every Jew. Bereish Parshaseinu hu nikra b'shem Mishkan ha'edus. In the very first pasuk of our parsha, the Mishkan is referred to as the tabernacle of witness, Edus li Yisrael. Why? because it's a witness for the Jews, Shavita lehem HaKadosh Baruch Hu al Maisa Egel, that Hashem forgave them for what they had done with the golden calf. Sharei hishrash kinasa b'neihem. What is the sign that Hashem forgave them? That His Shechina, that His presence is resting among them in the Mishkan. Va'al kain, and therefore, nidvais kol yud gimel tezvav hadvarim hayu tzriches lehinasein ba'ofen sheyikansu leba'alusay hamuchlete shel hatzibor. So it was absolutely critical that everything that was donated, and there's two opinions, that there were 13 materials or there were 15 materials, but all of those had to be donated in a way that they were completely transferred to the ownership, the unequivocal ownership of the tzibor, of the collective. V'lo yisharu shayachim liyachid. And it was very important that they did not remain in the ownership of an individual. V'davar zeh nasa be'emtzos havaz kol hanedavos l'Moshe. And this happened, this transfer to the collective happened through the fact that it was all brought to Moshe. And who is Moshe? Shahaya Nasi Kol Yisrael. As Rashi teaches, Hanasi Hu Hakol. The leader of the generation is the collective, is all of Bnei Yisrael. Ki al yedei zeh nichnisa kol hatruma shehiviu Bnei Yisrael legeder nichsei tzibor. Through bringing them to Moshe, Moshe is the Nasi, Hanasi Hu Hakol. The Nasi is the tzibor. So now everything that they brought became the assets that belong to the collective. Moshe as nidvos hamishkan b'dei betzalel v'aholiya v'chol ish chacham leiv al menos lasos mehenes kol malachos hamishkan. So first, everything was brought to Moshe. Then it became the assets of the collective. But then Moshe gave all of the materials to Betzalel and Aholiav because they were in charge of actually building this project. And especially if you want to say that they were not paid for their craftsmanship. They were not paid for overseeing this complex project. So through the fact that they oversaw this project, that they actually effectuated this project, so there's some type of ownership that they have over these materials. Shem ha'umnin al hamlacha, because it's an expression that the craftsperson puts a mark on their work. Okay, it's like when you say that's an actual Rembrandt or Picasso or whatever, you refer to it by the craftsperson. They put their mark on it. And the Rebbe says that this is true in some subtle way, even though, legally speaking, of course, the materials never left the ownership of the collective, but still, there could be this intermediary space where it could be seen as belonging to them. And therefore, it was necessary for, after everything was built, for Moshe to do an accounting, for him to delineate everything line by line. After Betzalel and the rest of those who were involved in the project finished the construction of the Mishkan, so it was necessary for Moshe to do this inventory, for him to take back, in a way, ownership of it all. So that in an unequivocal way, it should all be the assets of the Mishkan. Shehu Eidos Yisrael Klal Yisrael. And the Mishkan is testimony for all of Israel that they were all forgiven. And so the assets have to belong to Klal Yisrael. Kilamar, this is to say, Bekach Yetzu HaMelachos Me'Hashaychos LiYechidim, Shechola alein al yidei asiyas betzal v'aliyah v'chol chachmei leiv, v'nasu l'nichzei tzibor legamrei. So by Moshe conducting this inventory at this point, once and emphatically, there is no more way to think that in any way, shape, or form, these assets belong to any individuals, but rather they belong to all of Klal Yisrael. And therefore, Hine Tekef La'achar HaPasuk Ele Pekudei HaMishkan, right after our parsha opens up with these are the accountings of the Mishkan, Asher Pukar al Pi Moshe, that were counted through the agency of Moshe, Koydem HaCheshbon, before Moshe starts delineating Halazav, Cheshbon HaKesef, Anacheshes v'chulei, Hifsik HaKosov b'shnei HaPsukim of B'tzalel v'Itar Eliyav. The Torah interrupts and inserts the reference to Betzalel and Aholiav and everybody on their team. And then Moshe gives the accounting, ki bekach, because through this, Muzbar HaTeichen v'Hatzerech b'Bekida al pi Moshe. This is the Torah's way of explaining to us why Moshe has to go through this exercise in the first place. Okay? So far, the Rebbe has given us or referenced two levels of understanding why the necessity to do this inventory. One is to exonerate Moshe of any suspicion. Second is that this is a way of making it emphatically clear and on every level, legalistically and spiritually, that this is materials that belong to Klal Yisrael. And why is this so important? Because the Mishkan belongs to all of Klal Yisrael. It's an edus. It's a testimony that they have been forgiven. Okay? Dalet. Kol devarim elu amurim b'negelim leches hamishkan. All of this is vis-a-vis the building of the Mishkan. Now, before the Rebbe returns to give us deeper levels of what was accomplished through Moshe counting, the Rebbe kind of makes a detour here to make a difference between the Mishkan and the Pekudei Kahuna. He says, Ach legabe Pekudei Kahuna, matzinu shetekev k'shenitztava alei Moshe ba'ata hakreve lecha, hudgash k'ma shekasav Rashi el atar, she'adavar yiyeh la'achri shetigmar melechas hamishkan. As soon as Moshe got the commandment that he should bring close the Kayanim, it was underscored, and Rashi says it right there, that this should happen after the Mishkan is constructed. Kilemar, that is to say, Zmanam shall Pekudei HaKahuna, asher al yadam miskayim ba'aron ubanav lekatre lekahanoi li. That the time for fashioning the clothing of the Kayanim, and it's through the agency of these clothing that the place of the Kohanim is solidified, that their consecration actually comes to fruition. So the fashioning, v'asiyasam, eina be'emtza malachas hamishkan oy bechlala. It was not to happen in middle of constructing the Mishkan or part of the building of the Mishkan. Ella asiyasam tzricha liyos dafka la'achar shetigmar melechas hamishkan. But it was clear from Hashem that this should happen specifically after the construction of the Mishkan, and that it's not part of the larger project. V'yishloimer hadiyuk bazeh. The Rebbe says we might say, what can we learn from this specificity? Chalois hakdusha lekahanoi li b'Mishkan. But Yechayla liyos rak kasher yeshna metzius shel makom haroyu lekiyum v'shachanti, umemela noitzeres efsharos lemetzius lekahanoi li. The Rebbe is explaining that the beginning, or to effect the whole idea of consecration of Kohanim, can only happen after there exists a place in which Hashem is going to rest His Shekhinah. And once that exists, that creates the possibility for Kohanim. it creates the possibility lemitzias hakahuna, l'sheiros. It creates the possibility for there to exist kohanim, the whole idea of serving Hashem. V'oz dafka yitachein l'katshei lachnisei b'kohuna alidei begadim. And it's only once there's a Mishkan and once Hashem's Shechina rests there that Moshe can consecrate these people and bring them into the Kahuna, which happens through the agency of the special vestments. Ach beterem kayemes hamatir shel mokem l'sharis by. But before there exists this space where Hashem will rest and where they will serve. Kol inyan zeh shel hasuk kohen v'shel kedushas kohen de mishkan v'chein levishas habgadim shehi prat b'kunasam umashlima isa ena b'metzias. But the whole idea of kohen, the whole rubric of kohen, the whole idea of a kohen in the mishkan, including their wearing of these vestments, which kind of completes the idea of their kahuna, is not in existence before there's a Mishkan. And this is also true regarding the fashioning of the vestments. Even fashioning these garments can only happen once there is a Mishkan. And note that the Rebbe says in parentheses, Chelek hazav, and then in parentheses later, Gamhu, Shemimenu nase bigdei akunim loy pukad ki loy haya tzarech bekach. And now we can understand why this portion of gold that was used to fashion the vestments of kahuna was not counted, because there was no need. Because what was the need for the whole project of counting and delineating everything in the Mishkan? Because it is connected, like the Rebbe taught us, to the idea that the Mishkan is Mishkan ha'edus. It's testimony to all of Bnei Yisrael being forgiven. It has to belong to all of them. Edus the Yisrael Shavita Lemakadosh Baruch Hu Ma'aseh Egel Sharei Hishvishchi Nasai Beinehem. As the Medrash says, as Rashi says, it's an edus that Hashem is resting. Umemela hayanachot shemelachas hamishkan sheba hishvishchi nasai tia hekdesh hashayach legamri leklal Yisrael. And so all of the assets must belong to all of Klal Yisrael. L'lo shum shaychas liyachidim. And it can't belong to just any individual, Shebi Yisrael. Not, we have to completely obviate the belonging of any of these assets to individuals, even the type of belonging that can happen through being the one who actually does the project. But in contradistinction, when you talk about the clothing, the vestments for the Kohanim, they're not part of creating the Mishkan. They belong and are part of the avodah that the Kohanim would do. Even though the halacha is that that also had to come from assets that belong to the collective. Mikol Mokim, still in all, loy nemra behem adgasha zu, shaloi tia lehem shum shayches la'isei ha'melacha, lefi shemitziosam eina chelek me mishkan ha'edus melachas ha'mishkan. So while it's true that these vestments had to be fashioned from materials that belong to the collective, that belong to all of Klal Yisrael, but we don't find the same emphasis on it being part of the Mishkan itself, because it's not part of the Mishkan ha'edus. It's not part of the Mishkan. And through this, we will further understand the difference in the donation. Nidvas ha'mishkan huva kula l'Moshe. Everything that was donated towards the construction of the Mishkan had to be brought to Moshe himself. Va'azai Bitzalel, Ahalia, v'chalish chacham leiv, natlua milfnei Moshe. And then the project manager and all the people involved in creating the Mishkan took it from Moshe. Kimitor because of, like it's written in the Torah. Masha Enkin Hazav Atcheles Chulei. But in contradistinction, the gold and the different colored wools, the crimson, etc., Asher Mehem Nasu Bigdei Kahuna, from which was fashioned the vestments, Af Shagam Mehem Bo Mitruma Hamikudeshes Lishmi, although they also came from the donations that, of course, were sanctified to Hashem, but regarding these materials, Bezalel and those that were on the team were able to take it. Oisam chachmei lev sheyasu abgodim yikablu min hamisnadvim es hazav vesatchelas lasis mehem habegodim. Rashi explains that all of the craftspersons that were making the begodim, they took the donations directly from those who came to bring it. Now, once the Rebbe explains the difference between the Bigdei Kahuna and the Melachas HaMishkan, now the Rebbe is going to circle back again to what was effectuated through Moshe doing this counting. Seif Hey. Al Pi Hanal, based on what we said above, Yitesef Bir Gam B'Tam Adavar She'in Yazen Nifal Al Yidei Moshe Dafka. We're drilling down again on the fact that Moshe had to make this accounting and that the materials had to be brought to him. Even though in the Gemara we have this idea that the transmission from the individual to the collective, that it be done wholeheartedly, yafe, that it be done in full-throated fashion, could also happen through the agency of a collector. In other words, if you have a collector that collects it and a person gives it to the collector, then that is enough to assure the full-hearted and the full-throated transfer. But still and all here, there's emphasis on it coming to Moshe and not going through just any collector. And it wasn't only because Moshe was the Nasi, which we already said above, but here the Rebbe is going to roll out a new level. Elagam mipnei sheMoshe mitzad atzmai loy niskak lekapora she'al yidei HaMishkan. But here's another level of why it had to go through the agency of Moshe. Because remember, the whole Mishkan is Mishkan Eidos. It's all about testifying as to the atonement of Bnei Yisrael for the Egel Hazav. And Moshe didn't need kapara. Hine al yedei haskuskam basiyas hamishkan noitra shaychus beinam oisei hamelacha ubein advarim shenasu al yadam umemela nigram chisaron b'shleimus hahekdash b'teres nichsei tzibor. Okay, this is very I don't know, subtle and kind of beautiful. The Rebbe explains that through Aliyah, through Bezalel, through their engagement with making the Mishkan, there was a connection that was created between them and the things that they made the Mishkan from. And there was some slight deficit in the completion of the consecration of these assets to the collective. And in order for these materials to completely belong to the collective, even after they fashioned it, it was necessary for it to go through Moshe again. And the actual erection of the Mishkan was through the agency of Moshe specifically. Vayaviu es HaMishkan al Moshe. They brought the Mishkan to Moshe. Hakol huva leMoshe va'al yodoi dafka hukam HaMishkan. And again, it's against our religion of this class to editorialize the middle, but just quickly to say that maybe we have a hint here about artistry and how an artist puts their mark, whether it be a song or a piece of art or whatever it is, and that there is a soul connection, as it were. So if there's something missing in the artist, there's going to be some type of deficit in what they put their mark on. A lot to unpack there, but not now. Vav, see Vav. V'yishloimar tam noisav l'kach shadavar kashul l'meisha dafka. The Rebbe says, and now we might say an additional reason for why this is so connected to Moshe. Hachidush Mishkan al pnei shar hamikdashos hu b'yosei nitzchi. What was novel about the Mishkan, juxtaposed on the other mikdashos, is that the Mishkan was eternal. Kedivrei HaGemara, like the Gemara explains, Shemisha Nivna Mikdash Rishon Nignaz Oyel Moed Krashav Karsav Ubrichav Amudav Adanav, that once the first base of Mikdash was built, all the components of the Mishkan were hidden away, but they were not destroyed. They didn't go bye-bye. They didn't evaporate. They were hidden away. Lefishan Mishkan Haya Maise Yadei Moshe. Because Moshe is considered the one who fashioned the Mishkan, even though Betzalel or there was a whole team, but it's Moshe's handiwork, and therefore it could never be destroyed or obviated. ולפיכך לאחר עשייתם של חלקי המשכן היה צריך בפקידה על פי משה בכל פרט ופרט של העשייה כדי שיהיה לעניין נצחי. So another level of why Moshe had to give this accounting after everything was created was so that he kind of puts his mark of eternity on it. Masha came big day kahuna. But not so with the holy vestments of the Kohanim. Ein inyanam lihishar nitzchim l'dayros. It was not meant that these vestments should remain eternally for all generations. Elahim rak prat muchrach bekim l'kahanoi shel kahanim ha'ovdim bebeis hamikdash. But they are a detail, a necessary detail in the consecration of the Kohanim that would work in the Beis Hamikdash. And indeed, we do not find the Gemara saying that they were hidden away for eternity like the Mishkan was. Going deeper, Seif Zayin. V'yeshloimar, we might say, Shabir Hanal v'pu'ulas Pekudei HaMishkan al pi Moshe, that the above stated explanation of what was effectuated through the counting of all the components of the Mishkan by Moshe, shehaminyan al pi Moshe palas hakesher ben hamishkan bekelev leMoshe, that by counting it, it affected this connection to Moshe. Matim gam leperish hapnimi shel ele pekudei hamishkan. This is aligned also with the deeper explanation on these words, Eile Pekudei HaMishkan. These are the accounting of the Mishkan. Can be Kafisha Mevar Rabbeinu Zaken beParshas HaChasidus Shel Shavua Zeh BeLekutei Torah. The Alter Rebbe explains this in the Hasidic Parsha, meaning in his explanations in Lekutei Torah on this Parsha. B'dvarav Sham, and in the Alter Rebbe's explanations there, Nizbar Perish Pekudei HaMishkan Pukad al Pi Moshe, the Alter Rebbe explains that this idea of the accounting of the Mishkan being counted and delineated via Moshe, that the term Pekida, the term Pukad, Pekudei, Shehu miloshain. It's the same terminology that's used in halacha. Chayav adam lifkoit as ishtay. That a man is obligated to remember to be with his wife intimately before he leaves on a trip. Ki hayichud nikra pekuda, because the idea of fusion, of unification, right? Because the Rebbe said that by Moshe counting every component of the Mishkan, this created a unification between Moshe and the Mishkan. The Alter Rebbe explains that this word pekida has a connotation of yichud, of unification. Hainu, shal yedei pekudei hamishkan, pukad al pi Moshe nase yichud, that through Moshe delineating, through Moshe counting, there was a fusion that was created of the Vav Hey of Hashem's name, which is the fusion between Zeir Ampin, Za, the seven midas, the six midas, and Malchus, v'achar kach nase yichud yud and afterwards is accomplished the yichud of the yud which is chachma and bina. V'yesh loymar, we might say, shezehu gam nishtalshlu mehem ma she'al yedei pukad al pi Moshe nase yichud bein hamishkan leMoshe she'hamishkan is ached Moshe beinu lemetzias achas kenal ba'arucha. So we might say that this deep, mystical, Hasidic explanation was nishtalshel. It devolved into the fusion that was effected between Moshe Rabbeinu and the Mishkan. And we're going to continue with Seif Ches, but because we want to respect our classmates who need to hop off earlier, but there's interesting things to unpack here in this link that the Rebbe affects between the Mishkan, Moshe's link with the Mishkan, physical intimacy between husband and wife, and so on and so forth. Ches. Haperish hanal bepekudei miloshen chayev adam lifkoid as ishtay. So this explanation, this link between the accounting in this parsha and the halacha that a man has to remember his wife, as it were, ain't a pirish nifred me a pirish hapasha milosha minim v'cheshbon. So the Rebbe says, don't think that this deeper level is separate and parallel, but not connected to the pshat. Elahim tluyim zeh bazeh. The Rebbe says, no, they're connected. They're intrinsically, inherently connected. Keitzad nifala hapakida, hayichud shel hamishkan and Moshe Rabbeinu. How do you affect this kind of yichud, pekida, miloshan yichud, al yedei inyan haminyan? It's only through counting. And this too is something we can unpack. What does it mean that intimacy happens through minyan? And I'm just going to give my thought. It's just conjecture. It's nothing definitive because I searched, I didn't find a source, but we'll go back to that. But now the Rebbe says, "V'yuvam b'haktim." We're going to understand the intrinsic connection between pekida in terms of yichud, fusion, creating one entity, and minyan, and delineating, which is the simple explanation, by prefacing with saying the follows: L'chayra, seemingly, shnei pirushim hanal, these two ideas, b'pikudei, in the notion, in the word of Pekudei, the inyan of minyan, counting, that we started with, and the inyan of yichud, that the Alter Rebbe teaches, hein pirushim hafchiyim, seemingly they're antithetical. Minyan hu adarga hachitzoinis v'hatachtoina b'yosa shel davar. V'oid hu madgish es hagbala shel hadvarim hanimnim loy pachais v'lo yoser. Seemingly, when you count something, that's the most external aspect of the thing. In other words, you have $4 billion. So counting 1, 2, 3, you're not talking about what the value is and what you're going to do with the money and what could be accomplished. It's just a placeholder. It's just you need to know how much, but that's not the heart and soul of anything when you count them. You count how many, I don't know, how many people are coming to Sheva Brachas. Because you practically need to have that number. You have to know how many cheers, how many, this is the sugya now that the Joni is deep into now. She has to know how many people are coming to Sheva Brachas. But that's what Sheva Brachas is about. It's about the chassan and the kala and the excitement and the binyan adayat. So it seems like it's the chitzonius, it's the tachton, it's the lowest aspect. And also it underscores the limited nature of it, because anything that can be counted is limited. So you're having 42 people that are coming to Sheva Brachas, not 45, not 85. Masha Enkein in Hapekida Vahayichud. But in contradistinction, yes, we count things that are precious to us. That's 100% true. And that gives us more of an understanding of the connection between minyan and pekida in terms of union. But on the other hand, that's not what makes it precious. And then the Rebbe says, so we're juxtaposing counting on the one hand against yichud, against fusion, which meir alis actus hapnimis bi'oser ad v'hayu lebasar echad, which physical intimacy underscores the deepest kind of union, which manifests also on the physical plane, that they become one flesh, which is a hamshacha shelemayla mimidida v'hagbala. This is affluence that comes from heaven that transcends all limitations. So whether there is physically a child that comes from the union, which is the kayach ein seif, right? Every neshama that comes down, and just the idea of generation, the idea that a new life can be generated, comes from infinity. And even as we're taught, even when there's no physical conception, there's conception of neshamas that are brought down. So again, we're talking about infinity. Umikol makom, the Rebbe says, and still in all, even though it seems like these two explanations are antithetical to each other, here's something that's, I think, I'm not sure, but I think is a chiddush in the Rebbe's Torah. Kevan she'elohim shnei perushim l'teva achas. Over and over in Sichas, the Rebbe underscores this, that whenever you have more than one explanation on one word or one concept in Torah, move on, it's understood. Commotion is barakama problem, and has been explained many times. That in addition to there being opposites of each other, harehim gam va'af ze ikar shayachim ze lazeh v'tluyim ze bazeh. On one hand, they're opposites, and on the other hand, because they're linked to the same word or the same concept in Torah, they are interlinked. They are part of one whole. Again, you see the holographic nature of the Rebbe's Torah. And the explanation is, Ze gufa hu inyanei v'tafkidei shel hamishkan. This itself, the fusing of finitude and infinity, of dichotomy, this is the purpose of the Mishkan. Netilas dvarim mugbolim dafka almanas lahamshich bigvul ze es habligvul. To take things that are by definition limited and to infuse them with the energy and the power of infinity. Ad la'ofen v'shel v'shachanti. Until Hashem's presence rests there. Ukepashtas inyan. And now let's just look like practically. Tchila nivna hamishkan. First, the Mishkan was built. Ula'achar became nifala hashras hashchina milmaila. Then Hashem's presence came down from above to rest in it. Ukvayit Hashem malayas hamishkan. And the Torah tells us, and the glory of Hashem filled the Mishkan. Ad lo'ifin kazu, and this happened to such an extent that even Moshe was not able to come in at certain times because the Shechina rested there. So isn't that exhibit A of the fusion of infinity with infinitude? And these two seemingly dichotomous ideas are both alluded to in Pekudei. Pekudei miloshem minyan. Pekudei as linked to the idea of counting and delineating. Haminyan she'asa Moshe Rabbeinu al manas la'arech es cheshbon nedavos hamishkan. The cheshbon that Moshe Rabbeinu made in order to be able to give the counting to Bnei Yisrael on the materials from which the Mishkan was fashioned. This Meir al Hagvul Sheba Mishkan. This teaches about the finitude of the Mishkan. Upekudei miloshem pekida v'yichud Meir al hamshachas habulikvul. And what the Alter Rebbe teaches, that this is linked to the idea in halacha, that a man has to remember, has to be together with, has to be fused with his wife. This is the inyan of Blikvul. Tes. Haperish hapnimi b'shnei havchim hanal. So the deeper explanation of the above said dichotomous explanations of Pekudei, einay rak shebemishkan iskaimu shnei havchim. It's not just that generally speaking, you had these two antithetical ideas going on, gvul ublikvul, that which is finite and that which is infinite. Ella yisera mizu, but more than this, sheshnehem nasu mitzias achas. They both became one entity. Hagvul gufa shel hamishkan nishar b'hagbalasai. But the Rebbe is underscoring they became one entity, and yet each maintained its own characteristic. Finitude remained finite. And at the same time, it became one and the same with that which was infinite. And where was this most manifest? In the Aron. Famously, the Gemara in Yuma explains, Asher ikar mishkan, menuchas hashchina, right? The Aron is ground zero of where the Shechina rested. And how is the fusion of these two manifest in the Aron? The Gemara explains that the Aron did not take up space, right? Because the Torah tells us how big the Kodesh HaKadoshim was. It tells us how much space there was between the Aron and the walls of the Kodesh HaKadoshim, and it doesn't compute. If you have to account for the space that the Aron itself took up. Davar. And the Rebbe explains, and what does it mean that Makam Aron ena min amida? Shaloi zu bevat sheba Makam Aron hayagali shchina shu ena min amida. Ela shemakam Aron gufa ena min amida. It's not just that the Aron was a place where the infinite glory of Hashem manifested, but it's that in the physical Aron, about which the Torah gives us the exact measurements for how long and how wide and how deep it was. There it didn't take up space. Yisera mizu. Dafka by bezman sha'arnai b'medido b'chala pratim eirech reicha v'kaima amasayim v'chatzi arkay v'ama v'chatzi rachbay v'ama v'chatzi kamasay azay b'vas achas eina min amida. In the exact measurements, that was 2.5 amas long, and it was 1.5 amma wide, and it was 1.5 amma deep, and at the same time, eina min hamida, didn't take up any space. V'zehu inyane shel hamishkan shehagvul gufahu b'li gvul. This is the inyan of the Mishkan, the fusion of gvul and b'li gvul, of finitude and infinity. V'zehu hakesher bin shnei hapirushim al Pekudei. And this is the connection between the two explanations on the word Pekudei. Moshe Rabbeinu arach es cheshbon hameduyak shel nidvas hamishkan. On the one hand, Moshe Rabbeinu conducted an exact accounting of everything having to do with the Mishkan. And it was this delineation, the counting, the seemingly most external aspect, how much gold, how much silver, how much copper, etc. This effectuated the infinite fusion, hamshachas hashchina v'hakdusha shelamayla mikvul, the bringing down of Hashem's presence and holiness that completely transcends any type of measure and parameters and borders, ba'ofen shel yichud im hagvul, as it becomes one with that which is measured. And included in this fusion is that which is finite, that which is measured, and that usually is synonymous with that which is fleeting and ephemeral. No, that becomes lasting and eternal. So that's the Sikha itself, and then Sippo will give us the allowance to speak.